umbilicus by the septum transversum. The cephalic portion of the septum takes part in the formation of the diaphragm, while the caudal portion, into which the liver grows, forms the ventral mesogastrium. The stomach undergoes a further dilation, and its two curvatures can be recognized, the greater directed towards the vertebral column, and the lesser towards the anterior wall of the abdomen, while its two surfaces look to the left and right respectively. Behind the stomach, the gut undergoes great elongation, and forms a V-shaped loop, which projects downwards and forward. From the bend or angle of the loop, the vitelline duct passes to the umbilicus. For a time, a considerable part of the loop extends beyond the abdominal cavity into the umbilical cord, but by the end of the 3rd month it is withdrawn within the cavity. With the lengthening of the tube, the mesoderm, which attaches it to the future vertebral column, and carries the blood vessels for the supply of the gut, is thinned and drawn out to form the posterior common mesentery. The portion of this mesentery attached to the greater curvature of the stomach is named the dorsal mesogastrium, and the part which suspends the colon is termed the mesocolon. About the 6th week, a diverticulum of the gut appears just behind the opening of the vitelline duct, and indicates the future cecum and vermiform process. The part of the loop on the distal side of the cecal diverticulum increases in diameter, and forms the future ascending and transverse portions of the large intestine. Until the 5th month, the cecal diverticulum has a uniform calibre, but from this time onward its distal part remains rudimentary and forms the vermiform process, while its proximal part expands to form the cecum. Changes also take place in the shape and position of the stomach. Its dorsal part, or greater curvature, to which the dorsal mesogastrium is attached, grows much more rapidly than its ventral part, or lesser curvature, to which the ventral mesogastrium is fixed. Further, the greater curvature is carried downward and to the left, so that the right surface of the stomach is now directed backward and the left surface forward, a change in position which explains why the left vagus nerve is found on the front and the right vagus on the back of the stomach. The dorsal mesogastrium being attached to the greater curvature must necessarily follow its movements, and hence it becomes greatly elongated and drawn lateralward and ventralward from the vertebral column, and, as in the case of the stomach, the right surfaces of both the dorsal and ventral mesogastria are now directed backward and the left forward. In this way a pouch, the bursa ommentalis, is formed behind the stomach, and this increases in size as the digestive tube undergoes further development. The entrance to the pouch constitutes the future foramen epiploicum, or foramen of Winslow. The duodenum is developed from that part of the tube which immediately succeeds the stomach. It undergoes little elongation, being more or less fixed in position by the liver and pancreas, which arise as diverticula from it. The duodenum is at first suspended by a mesentery, and projects forward in the form of a loop. The loop and its mesentery are subsequently displaced by the transverse colon, so that the right surface of the duodenal mesentery is directed backward, and, adhering to the parietal peritoneum, is lost. The remainder of the digestive tube becomes greatly elongated, and as a consequence the tube is coiled on itself, and this elongation demands a corresponding increase in the width of the intestinal attachment of the mesentery, which becomes folded. At this stage, the small and large intestines are attached to the vertebral column by a common mesentery, the coils of the small intestine falling to the right of the middle line, while the large intestine lies on the left side. Footnote: sometimes this condition persists throughout life, and it is then found that the duodenum does not cross from the right to the left side of the vertebral column, but lies entirely on the right side of the median plane, where it is continued into the jejunum. The arteries to the small intestine also arise from the right instead of the left side of the superior mesenteric artery. End of footnote. The gut is now rotated upon itself, so that the large intestine is carried over in front of the small intestine, and the cecum is placed immediately below the liver. About the 6th month the cecum descends into the right iliac fossa, and the large intestine forms an arch consisting of the ascending, transverse, and descending portions of the colon. The transverse portion crossing in front of the duodenum and lying just below the greater curvature of the stomach. Within this arch the coils of the small intestine are disposed. Sometimes the downward progress of the cecum is arrested, so that in the adult it may be found lying immediately below the liver instead of in the right iliac region. Further changes take place in the bursa ommentalis and in a common mesentery, and give rise to the peritoneal relations seen in the adult. The bursa ommentalis, which at first reaches only as far as the greater curvature of the stomach, grows downward to form the greater omentum, and this downward extension lies in front of the transverse colon and the coils of the small intestine. Above, before the pleuroperitoneal opening is closed, the bursa ommentalis sends up a diverticulum on either side of the oesophagus. The left diverticulum soon disappears, but the right is constricted off and persists in most adults as a small sac lying within the thorax on the right side of the lower end of the oesophagus. The anterior layer of the transverse mesocolon is at first distinct from the posterior layer of the greater omentum, but ultimately the two blend, and hence the greater omentum appears as if attached to the transverse colon. The mesenteries of the ascending and descending parts of the colon disappear in the majority of cases, while that of the small intestine assumes the oblique attachment characteristic of its adult condition. The lesser omentum is formed, as indicated above, by a thinning of the mesoderm or ventral mesogastrium, which attaches the stomach and duodenum to the anterior abdominal wall. By the subsequent growth of the liver, this leaf of mesoderm is divided into two parts, that is, the lesser omentum between the stomach and liver, and the falciform and coronary ligaments between the liver and the abdominal wall and diaphragm. The rectum and anal canal. The hindgut is at first prolonged backward into the body stalk as the tube of the allantois, but with the growth and flexure of the tail end of the embryo, the body stalk, with its contained allantoic tube, is carried forward to the ventral aspect of the body, and consequently a bend is formed at the junction of the hindgut and allantois. This bend becomes dilated into a pouch, which constitutes the entodermal cloaca. Into its dorsal part the hindgut opens, and from its ventral part the allantois passes forward. At a later stage, the Wolffian and Mullerian ducts open into its ventral portion. The cloaca is for a time shut off from the anterior by a membrane, the cloacal membrane, formed by the apposition of the ectoderm and entoderm, and reaching at first as far forward as the future umbilicus. Behind the umbilicus, however, the mesoderm subsequently extends to form the lower part of the abdominal wall and symphysis pubis. By the growth of the surrounding tissues, the cloacal membrane comes to lie at the bottom of a depression, which is lined by ectoderm and named the ectodermal cloaca. The entodermal cloaca is divided into a dorsal and a ventral part by means of a partition, the urorectal septum, which grows downward from the ridge separating the allantoic from the cloacal opening of the intestine, and ultimately fuses with the cloacal membrane and divides it into an anal and a urogenital part. The dorsal part of the cloaca forms the rectum, and the anterior part of the urogenital sinus and bladder. For a time, a communication named the cloacal duct exists between the two parts of the cloaca below the urorectal septum. This duct occasionally persists as a passage between the rectum and urethra. The anal canal is formed by an invagination of the ectoderm behind the urorectal septum. This invagination is termed the proctodeum, and it meets with the entoderm of the hindgut and forms with it the anal membrane. By the absorption of this membrane, the anal canal becomes continuous with the rectum. A small part of the hindgut projects backward beyond the anal membrane It is named the post anal gut